Picture something that should be impossible. Vietnam, the middle of the 1960s. An American soldier carrying the newest rifle in the world leans over the body of a dead enemy, picks up the enemy's weapon, and walks back into the fight, holding it. I read about this years ago and honestly assumed it was a myth. Things like that don't happen. The richest army on Earth, a country that within a few years will land a man on the moon, cannot possibly fail at the simplest task war has to offer. Give a soldier a rifle that fires. But it isn't a myth. And the most disturbing part of this story isn't the malfunctions. The most disturbing part is that the people who designed, tested, and fielded that rifle were intelligent, competent, and genuinely convinced they were doing everything right. Because this is not a story about two pieces of metal. It's a story about two philosophies, about who an army chooses to trust, the human being or the procedure, and about what happens when a philosophy turns out to be wrong. To understand where the Kalashnikov came from, you have to stand in the Soviet Union in 1943. The German army is already using an intermediate cartridge, and Soviet specialists work out something simple. The old rifle round is too powerful for real fighting. It's built for shots at a kilometer, and men are mostly shooting at 200 or 300 meters. So you can make the cartridge weaker, the weapon lighter, and give a soldier the ability to fire bursts. By 1947, several designs are competing. The winner is built by a man named Kalashnikov, a former tank crewman wounded early in the war. His rifle was not chosen because it was the most accurate. It was chosen because it worked. Kalashnikov himself repeated a line that sounds like a platitude until you try to follow it. Everything complex is unreliable. Everything simple is reliable. Behind that sentence is a man who sat inside a tank, who saw a retreat with his own eyes, and who knew exactly what happens to machinery when everything goes badly. And here begins what I consider the real beauty of this design, and it's almost never explained properly. Inside the rifle, the parts are fitted loosely. There are gaps between them. By normal engineering logic, that sounds like sloppy manufacturing. In reality, it's a deliberate decision. If sand, water, dust, or mud gets inside, it has somewhere to go. The mechanism keeps moving. It's cruder, it's louder, it rattles, and that is precisely why it is almost impossible to stop. The second decision matters even more. The inside of the barrel and the chamber are given a hard protective coating that shields the metal from corrosion. The weapon can spend a month lying in a wet trench and survive. This was cheap, well-understood technology, but it was applied deliberately as a foundation of the design rather than a luxury. And the third. The rifle strips down in seconds, without tools, by hand. The cover comes off, the spring comes out, the bolt is in your palm. Repairs are possible in the field, in the dark, with frozen fingers. Now ask yourself the real question. Who was all of this built for? Answer that, and you have the heart of this film. The Soviet army assumed its soldier was a conscript, often a village boy, often with a couple of years of technical schooling, often from a region where nobody had ever seen a precision mechanism. He will not read the manual. He will not clean his weapon meticulously every evening according to regulation. He will be exhausted, frightened, soaking wet, and hungry. So the design demands nothing from him. It forgives in advance everything he is going to do wrong. It's worth pausing on what that meant in practice. An enormous country that has just lost millions of people is preparing for a possible new war on the same scale. It needs to arm not hundreds of thousands, but millions, quickly, cheaply, from available materials, in factories not staffed exclusively by master craftsmen. And it must work at 30 below zero, in sand, in swamp, and after 10 years in a warehouse nobody ever visited. That's why calling the Kalashnikov primitive is, to me, a complete misreading of what happened. Making a complicated thing good is not that hard, given time and money. Throwing away everything unnecessary and keeping exactly what decides a fight is genuinely difficult. It's engineering of the highest order. It just gets judged by the elegance of its lines instead of the number of people it managed to arm. Now let's look at the other side of the world. In 1950s America, the engineers think differently, and they think brilliantly. A rifle appears made of aluminium and plastic. It is light, It has almost no felt recoil because the force travels straight back into the shoulder along one line. It is remarkably accurate. Even an untrained person can hit with it because the weapon barely jumps. Its cartridge is small and very fast. A soldier can carry roughly twice as much ammunition for the same weight. In a fight decided by volume of fire, that is an enormous advantage. I want to be fair here. This was a magnificent rifle, not in marketing terms, in engineering terms. Many of the ideas inside it are still alive in modern weapons, which is exactly why its descendants arm half the planet. The problem was not the design. The problem was 3 decisions made by people in offices. Decision 1. The rifle was developed around one type of propellant. Then it turned out there wasn't enough of that propellant for mass production, so cartridges were loaded with a different, available one. It burned differently. It left more residue and drove the mechanism faster than intended. Decision 2. To save money and simplify production, the internal surfaces were not given that hard protective coating. On a dry range, this means nothing. In a humid climate, where the air itself smells of water, it means the metal starts rusting literally overnight. And decision 3, the one that still makes my fists clench. Soldiers were told the new rifle barely needed cleaning. This was presented as a virtue of modern technology. Cleaning kits were simply not included with the first batches. There's one more detail people rarely mention. The rifle was rushed into service. The war was already running, the old weapon was considered too heavy for close jungle, and decisions were made fast. Enormous quantities went to the troops before anyone had properly checked how they behaved in permanent humidity, in mud, and in the hands of a tired man nobody had bothered to explain anything to. Now add those 3 decisions together and put the result into a jungle. The rifle began to jam. Not occasionally, in combat. The spent case stayed stuck in the chamber because the metal had swollen and seized, and the next round slammed into it. To keep shooting, you had to push a cleaning rod down the barrel from the muzzle and hammer the stuck case back out. That took tens of seconds. In a firefight, 10 seconds is eternity. Try to feel that physically. The tropics. Humidity so complete that clothing doesn't dry for weeks. You walk through mud, you fall into water, you crawl through clay. Your weapon is open to all of it the entire time. Then the shooting starts. You squeeze the trigger, you hear one shot, and then silence. And you understand that you have to strip your rifle right now, lying down, under fire, with hands that are shaking. I have read the letters that went home in those months, and they are very hard texts. Soldiers and Marines wrote the same thing over and over. Our dead are being found next to weapons they had taken apart. Men died trying to fix a rifle under fire. One of those letters was read aloud in Congress. That's exactly why soldiers started doing what people always do in that situation. They looked for a way to survive. Some carried older weapons that had been declared obsolete. Some refused to let go of a submachine gun or a shotgun. And some picked up a captured enemy rifle, because that thing worked every single time, regardless of what anybody thought about it in an office. In 1967, hearings began in the United States. A special subcommittee examined the rifle's history and eventually produced conclusions still considered among the harshest in the history of American military procurement. It was not about bad luck or bad metal. It was about decisions taken formally and warnings that were ignored. At this point, the 2 weapons stop being weapons and become philosophies. The Soviet school said, the soldier will get everything wrong, so the machine has to absorb it. Responsibility sits with the design. The American school said, we have trained people, manuals, logistics, and order. Do it correctly and everything works. Responsibility sits with the procedure. Notice how much deeper this is than an argument about steel. One army looks at its soldier and says, he will make mistakes, get tired, forget, run out of time. Therefore, the machine must tolerate it. The other looks at its soldier and says, he is educated, he is trained, he is part of a system where things are done by the book. Therefore, we can afford a more demanding and more sophisticated design. Both positions are reasonable, both are honest. But one of them is calibrated for an ideal world, and the other for the real one. And the jungle chose the second. That is why the impossible picture became real. The soldier standing over a dead enemy did not take that rifle out of respect or affection. He took the thing that fires. It is the coldest and most honest choice a human being can make. And then comes the part I love. Because the American Army did what strong systems do. It admitted the mistake and fixed everything. Internal surfaces got a protective coating. A device was added to let the bolt be pushed forward by hand. The mechanics were altered to slow the rate down. And crucially, people were trained to clean their weapons, and cleaning kits were actually issued. Simple visual instructions appeared, literally comic strips, so that everybody would understand. And the rifle started working. Not by magic, but because somebody finally did what should have been done at the beginning. Now let's be equally honest about the Kalashnikov, because it was turned into a myth too. It was not the best weapon of the war. At distance, it lost on accuracy. It threw the shooter around more in bursts, because the cartridge is more powerful. Its ammunition is heavier, so the soldier carries less. Its sights were crude. On paper, the enemy's grouping was better. There is a flip side to the legend of invincibility as well. The Kalashnikov also needs maintenance. It also breaks, and left in the mud for years, it also stops firing. Its failure threshold is simply much further away. That difference in threshold created the entire mythology, which both sides then inflated into something close to religion. And, incidentally, this story has an uncomfortable sequel in our own time. Decades later, the American Army again found itself in conditions its weapon disliked. Only now, the enemy was not humidity, but the finest desert sand. It gets into everything, grinds the metal, and forces constant cleaning. Once again, it turned out that maintenance discipline is not a detail, but a component of combat power. Put both weapons on a clean range, and the American rifle wins. Leave them both in mud for a week, and the Kalashnikov wins. And the whole story reduces to one question. Where exactly does the real war take place? Then something happened that almost nobody expected. The two schools walked toward each other. Soviet engineers studied the American cartridge very carefully. As early as the beginning of the 1960s, they understood that a small, fast bullet offers real advantages. Less recoil, more accurate bursts, more rounds on the soldier. By 1974, the Soviet Army had a rifle chambered for a new, smaller cartridge. The design stayed familiar and recognizable, but the idea had crossed the ocean. Notice the irony. The Soviet side adopted precisely the idea that had caused its opponent so much suffering in the jungle. Because the idea itself was right. What failed was the execution, and that office optimism. Meanwhile, the Americans moved the other way. Their rifles got shorter and handier for fighting in confined spaces. Attention shifted toward tolerating dirt and not requiring perfect conditions. And a habit appeared of telling the soldier in plain words what to do, instead of assuming he would read the manual. Today's Kalashnikovs are covered in rails, optics, and lights, and their ergonomics are built the way only Western designers used to build them. Modern American rifles are reliable enough that the old complaints read like history from another era. The argument about who got there first is almost comic. One side says, "We invented the small, fast bullet, and you copied the idea." The other says, "We invented a weapon that isn't afraid of dirt, and you eventually came round to it." Formally, both are right, because they're talking about different things that simply met inside one rifle. Both camps ended up in roughly the same place, and both remain sincerely convinced they got there first. I find that genuinely funny. But the real conclusion of this story has nothing to do with metal. Weapons are not designed against the enemy. Weapons are designed around your own soldier, around how much time he has, how much training he has, what condition he's in, and what the system that sent him there actually believes. The Soviet school began from distrust of circumstances and produced a machine that forgives. The American school began from faith in order and produced a machine that demands. The first won in the mud, the second won in the long run. I think the fairest description is this: the Americans built the better tool for an army that can maintain it. The Soviets built the better tool for an army that won't get the chance. Both were right in different conditions. The mistake was never in the design. It was in the confidence that reality would arrange itself around your regulations. That's the real ending. Not the victory of one rifle over another, but the moment when a young man in soaking wet fatigues holds a broken mechanism designed by intelligent people who were certain they had thought of everything. One more thing won't let go of me. Not a single engineer wanted it to turn out this way. Every one of them was solving a reasonable problem. Make it lighter, make it cheaper, speed up delivery, stay inside the budget. Bad decisions almost never look bad at the moment they are made. They look sensible. And that is exactly why this story still matters. It isn't about two rifles or two countries. It's about the gap between the people who make a decision and the people who will live with its consequences. I can't forget one detail. They were found next to weapons they had taken apart. Right to the last second, they were trying to do everything by the book.